Thank you so much for the kind introduction, Jack. And this looks like a fascinating, lineup of speakers and set of research goals you have. And thank you to all the other organizers for putting this together. I'm so excited to be here before y'all today. Um, yeah, so I'm William Agnew. As Jack said, I'm a postdoc at Carnegie Mellon. And I'm here to present kind of a couple of papers that touch on public values in AI in different ways. Um, and I hope that these will be interesting not only for their kind of research questions I'm looking at, what are the values in AI, what are the impacts in AI, which is obviously closely tied to the values of AI, and then how can we, even change the dominant values of AI. But it sounds like y'all are working on, kind of similar questions with similar data sets. So hopefully, the methods I'm talking about and the limitations we found in those methods will be interesting to y'all as well. Um, so, I'm happy to take questions at any time, but I'll leave that to the moderators. I can't see the QA when I'm presenting, but please don't be shy. I love questions. Yeah. So the first paper I want to talk about is kind of a study on bias we did, which is now like way back in the day, just kind of at the start of large foundation models being a thing. Um, and bias is one of the ways that values really manifest in AI. It shows like which groups are more or less important, which groups are going to be better served by AI or harmed by AI, and like more broadly, like what we care about when we're designing AI. Because if bias gets in, obviously we find that bias acceptable in the AI, and that's a big statement of our values. So in this paper, we just asked, what is in language data sets? These are many terabytes of text scraped from the web. Historically, they've been difficult to understand because they are so large. And we just wanted to know what's the contents? Where did they come from? What is this text talking about? What are we training our LLMs on? And then we also wanted to know what biases do they contain and are they toxic in any ways? And if they are toxic, to whom, which groups are they toxic towards? So we looked at the Common Crawl dataset, which back then was one of the larger text data sets and is still like pretty widely used. It comes from this nonprofit called Common Crawl, which just crawls the internet and creates large text dumps of the entire internet available for anyone to use. And they're also a pretty fascinating organization, definitely a strong expression of values of everything on the internet should be freely available in like mass archive form for use in any way. That's kind of their statement of values, which a lot of like journalists and other people do not agree with. So it comes from this nonprofit. Um, and the Common Crawl dataset was this dump, and it's been cleaned to improve quality a little bit. And they also did some filtering to remove unwanted content. So, here we kind of see this filtering process. So at the top, we have C4 with no cleaning. It's 2.3 terabytes of text. And then after we apply cleaning, and we apply this block list filtering, so we just remove documents that contain words on this block list, we get down to only 305 gigabytes of text, which is still like kind of billions of tokens, where each token is like roughly one syllable. So first we looked through like what websites are represented in this data set. Um, so when we look at domains, we find a lot of .coms, so commercial websites, a lot of .orgs, so maybe nonprofits, it's not really enforced. Quite a bit of stuff from the UK, .co.uk, .org.uk, some stuff from New Zealand as well, a lot of government websites. Um, and then, and this is all, log scale. So keep in mind that like the difference in bars is quite large. We found the single biggest source is Google patents, patents.google.com. And, I don't know if y'all have ever like had the pleasure of reading a patent before, but it's a very kind of dense and specific kind of language, which we found interesting. It's maybe not language you would want a language model to be using all the time. And then also Wikipedia. And after that, just various news websites are highly represented. And, this is also interesting because we did this in 2021. In 2023, after ChatGPT came out, the New York Times ended up suing OpenAI for using the New York Times archive to train ChatGPT. So this kind of like predicted current conflicts we're seeing around these large language models using journalistic sources in their data sets. We also found that there's a bias towards mostly US and Western countries in this data set. So a lot of countries are underrepresented. And then we looked at the filtering itself. So there's this block list of like banned words that are removed. If the document contains any one of those banned words, it gets removed. So we looked at, what identity terms appear in these documents that are being removed. And what we found is that words related to queer identities are removed at very, very high rates, while words relating to like European, white, straight, Christian are removed at the lowest rate. So there is this interesting phenomenon where, this group that is already marginalized, that already has like less text about them on the internet, this text is then filtered out at a higher rate than these kind of dominant majority groups that have more text about them. And then when we look at toxicity, we find again that a lot of marginalized groups have text that is just less positive compared to other groups that are, maybe historically um, um, less marginalized. Although that's not completely true. There are some like um, outliers in this as well that we think a further analysis would help explain. So a couple of takeaways from this paper, again, many biases and types of toxicities found in LLMs are also found in their data sets. So we see this strong association, and that definitely leads us to kind of advocate for data set transparency when, auditing or assessing or regulating LLMs. We think it's very important to see what's in the data set to understand the behavior of the LLM. Making large data sets is, very challenging work. But if it's not done properly, it will cause serious problems in downstream models. Your model might be biased. You might get sued by the New York Times. And then lastly, bad word filtering disproportionately impacts marginalized and especially queer text, kind of removing texts that are from this group that are already underrepresented. So next, I want to talk about this paper we did, the values encoded in machine learning research. So for this paper, we, had kind of a very basic question. At the time, machine learning systems were already widely deployed, and their impact has only grown since we did this paper. And these systems reflect the values of their creators, whether that's explicitly or whether it's implicitly. So we wanted to know, what are the values of the machine learning community? What are we as a community trying to do? So we decided to look at values, not the current state of research, to understand where we're going, to find something that is maybe more durable than the, neural network architecture of the month. Um, we also saw that there were many ethics statements and guidelines, but little incentivization or enforcement. So we wanted to see how that would manifest in papers. And then finally, we found that many researchers thought that machine learning is often value neutral or apolitical. So we wanted to examine this assumption and maybe produce some data to challenge it a little bit. So I guess one thing I'm going to assert is that computer science research is political, and here I'm using maybe a broad definition of politics, where I'm saying politics is power relations between people, so group decision making, distribution of resources, and status. So, this includes party politics like capital P politics, but also includes things like digital privacy and security, or lack thereof, policing, both governmental and extra-governmental, access to technology, and who benefits from tech and the wealth generated by tech. So here's some like further reading. I'll I guess there's a recording, so y'all can go back to the recording if you want to see these, but these are all very interesting. So kind of our central methodological challenge for this paper was how do we measure the values of the machine learning community? And we decided to do this by annotating 100 of the most highly cited NeurIPS and ICML papers. NeurIPS and ICML are the two top conferences in machine learning. And we chose to annotate 50 from 2008 to 2009 and 50 from 2018 to 2019, which at the time was like the present day, and then a decade in the past. So we could see how they would change. And we annotated for 71 different values in 6 broad categories, including just general machine learning values, performance, advances in understanding, practical application, user rights, and some ethical principles that we found from other value statements. We also annotated what we called the justificatory chain. So this is kind of how the paper justifies the problem that it's researching. So some papers would say, oh, cancer is bad. We need to cure cancer. To cure cancer, we need better drugs. To get better drugs, we need better protein folding. To get better protein folding, we need to improve this machine learning algorithm. And they kind of have that chain of reasoning to justify the societal benefits of what they are working on. And then finally, we were very curious about any discussion of potential negative impacts of research. So we also annotated any mentions of that. So here are some of our results. When we looked at the kind of justificatory chain, the connection between a societal benefit or impact and the problem being researched, we found that a majority of papers, 68%, did not really mention any societal need that they were working towards solving. And only a few papers, 4%, really rigorously justified how their work connected to a societal need. And by rigorous, we just mean kind of like the same standard um, that other parts of the paper were held to, just providing citations behind the claims that they were making. We weren't expecting anything really, really involved. But even then, only 4% of the papers cleared that bar. When we looked at negative impacts, we found that almost all papers, 98%, did not mention any negative potential impacts of their work. And only 2% of the papers contain some mention of negative potential impact. There's really only one paper that had kind of an in-depth discussion of potential negative impact of its work. So this is a pretty like strong value statement in my opinion of what the machine learning community cares about. They are not interested in, potential negative impacts or unexpected downstream harms from the work. That's just not something that is considered in this community. And then finally, here are the top machine learning values that we annotated for. We found the top values are performance, generalization, building on past work, quantitative evidence, efficiency, and novelty. And then kind of some of the least popular values we found were those pertaining to user rights and ethical principles. So things like transparency, collective influence, criticability, respect for persons, and autonomy appeared rarely, if at all. And really beneficence and interpretability were the only values that appeared in kind of any minor number at all. We also looked at author affiliations to understand, what are some like funding motivations underlying this. So we saw a big change from 2008 to 2009 to 2018 to 2019. We found that the share of authors working at a tech company almost doubled, going from about 50 to over 80%. And the share of authors working at a big tech company, which we define as mostly Google, Microsoft, Facebook, NVIDIA, and Amazon. Also, a few others at the time that might have changed a little bit. That nearly tripled, going from 20% to over 60%. So, who is funding the field and where people are working for changed a lot over this time. And then when we look at affiliations, so including both like where people work for, but also where they're getting funding for, we found a similar trend. So a decade ago, over 3/4 of the paper had no corporate affiliation, no corporate funding. Um, but back in 2018, 2019, it turned out that the majority of the papers had some sort of corporate affiliation or funding. So some takeaways from this paper. Machine learning community values performance generalization building on past work, quantitative evidence, and efficiency very highly. It does not value strong connections to societal problems or rigorous discussions of negative uses very highly. Machine learning research has become highly entangled with industry, and a lot of these machine learning values serve industry interests very well. So the final paper I want to talk about, and I guess it appeared in Nature a couple of months ago, is mapping the surveillance AI pipeline. So in this paper, we wanted to understand what is computer vision used for? Because a common refrain in AI ethics statements is that this work is theoretical. There are no obvious applications or impacts. We can't understand, the downstream impacts of our work. And we really wanted to push back on this, but we found that there's a little like systematic understanding of how AI is being used. So to answer this question, we decided to look at patents citing papers published in CVPR. So many patents will actually cite papers in different ways. So we took that as like an important connection between some research and a patent. And we argue that patents offer a very imperfect window into real world applications. People are patenting something sometimes because it's an actual product that's going to be made, sometimes to prevent competitors from making a product that they think might be influential. Sometimes for other reasons, bonuses or like work incentives. But we think it's often a window into real or potential real world applications of some research. So to connect patents and papers, we turn to Microsoft Academic Graph, which contains citation networks, paper authors, institutions, fields, and locations, and a lot of other really cool metadata. And then we got this reliance on science data set, which contains patent citations of papers. And we kind of combined them to make this data set connecting Microsoft Academic Graph to patents. And then we scraped a lot of patents. I think about 500,000 patents from Google Scholar, or sorry, Google Patents, to create this like large data set, very rich in metadata. So we had this like extremely large data set, and we first approached it by just doing some manual annotation. So we first decided to look at, what human data is discussed in patents, like what data are they trying to work on. And we found that the majority of data being analyzed in patents that are citing CVPR research is human data. So a lot of it uses human body parts or human bodies, and then a lot of the rest of it uses human spaces or traces of, kind of socially salient human data. And only a very small number of these patents use something that is like truly not human data, like maybe data of forests or space, or just other things that really don't contain traces of humans. And then in this graph, we looked at kind of keywords in patents that we identified as being like relevant to their use. Um, and it's a little complicated, but basically we have this citation distance to the patent keyword. And by citation distance, I mean the number of cites from a CVPR paper to the patent. So citation distance of 0 means that CVPR paper is directly cited in that patent. Citation distance of 1 means that CVPR paper is cited in a paper, and then that paper is cited in the patent, and then so on for a citation distance of 2 and 3. So you can kind of look at these long chains of citations that eventually lead to a patent. And we found that when you go out to a citation distance of 3, a majority of CVPR papers are cited in a patent that just contains the word surveillance, which says a lot about, um, how companies are finding this work applicable. But are some bright spots. Medical also appears in the majority of patents that are eventually citing CVPR papers. And there's just a lot of other words that are kind of harder to interpret as well. We can also look at, what subfields of computer vision are eventually cited in surveillance patents. And like, are there subfields that are especially cited in surveillance patents? So we found that this is a very like long-tailed distribution. Basically, every subfield of computer vision has some ties to surveillance patents. But the top ones are, background subtraction, which makes a lot of sense. Object class detection, again, makes a lot of sense. Camera auto calibration makes a lot of sense as well, that all three of these fields would be used for kind of surveillance applications. Next, we're able to use some of the metadata to look at, what institutions have the highest number of papers eventually cited in surveillance patents. So we found that from 1980 to 2000, the institutions, were MIT, CMU, where I'm at, Cornell, Stanford, just a lot of like universities. Bell Labs is also in there, but much less than kind of all these other places. And then when we look at a more recent window, 2000 to 2020, we see that it's changed a lot. Microsoft is far and away the greatest producer of computer vision research that's eventually used in a surveillance patent. CMU, some other universities are still up there, but we see, Mitsubishi Group, Google, these corporations are also now heavily involved in the surveillance research. We can also look at, the geography of this. Which countries are producing computer vision papers that are eventually cited in surveillance patents? And we find that the US is far and away the greatest producer of surveillance patents. Canada, a lot of Europe are doing a lot of this. China has also emerged as a country that's doing a lot of work that is eventually used in surveillance patents. But far and away, the US is the greatest producer of this kind of work. So we were also able to look at, this data set is extremely granular. We have names, companies, institutions for all of this stuff. So we decided to look into like a few like specific companies to see if there are connections between CVPR and the products that these specific companies are producing. So we first looked at kind of surveillance tech along the US-Mexico border, which has kind of been heavily built up with all this surveillance stuff. Um, and we found that a lot there are a number of CVPR papers that do eventually have a patent downstream used by these surveillance companies along the US border. So we have stuff like Motorola doing automated license plate readers, border surveillance towers from Elbit Systems and General Dynamics, mobile video surveillance, vehicle hacking, either phone hacking, surveillance drones. All these companies have um, surveillance patents that are citing CVPR papers, and we know that they are kind of building these surveillance products along the US-Mexico border. We can also ask similar questions about predictive policing and police surveillance tech. And again, we find, companies like Predpol, Nightscope, Boston Dynamics, Hikvision doing facial recognition. All these companies have used computer vision, CVPR, computer vision research in their surveillance patents. So we know they're producing these surveillance products. So a couple takeaways from this. Downstream impacts are often challenging to determine, but examining downstream patents is very feasible and seems to provide a lot of relevant information about impacts. About half of CVPR papers have downstream surveillance patents, and the top producers of computer vision research used for surveillance are largely the same as the top producers of computer vision research, just because surveillance applications are quite pervasive in the field. Then finally, if you don't like surveillance and publish in CVPR or computer vision in general, be thoughtful and careful about potential negative uses of your work. So in the last few minutes before we jump to questions, I'm going to talk about some work I did on resistance. So trying to change the dominant values in AI. So there are a lot of current computer vision current AI ethics approaches. These include things like auditing, licenses, standards and principles, regulation, and advocacy. And while these approaches have yielded concrete wins, and are important, they have some common weaknesses. So specifically, they take a while to have concrete impacts typically, and they often require action or consent by the powerful. So if you're doing like regulation to address AI harms, you need policymakers to actually get behind it. And usually that requires like getting their donors and other key constituencies behind it as well. So if you are trying to challenge power, but your method of challenging power requires consent by the powerful or cooperation by the powerful to be effective, that's kind of a big weakness in that method. So in this paper, we kind of look at resistance to understand ways of challenging power that do not require consent by the powerful. And we build on that to propose technologies of resistance to AI to create a set of methods that addresses gaps in current AI ethics approaches. So what is resistance? We develop a theory of what effective resistance is through a series of case studies of some different groups that have resisted, including Luddites, agricultural workers, and different protesters. And we propose the following taxonomy for assessing and designing effective technologies of resistance to AI. So basically, we say that resistance has kind of four key measures. So the first is challenging power. Who needs to consent to this act of resistance for it to happen? Is it just the individual or the group being harmed? Or, is it groups that are not being harmed or groups that are even benefiting from what's going on? Do they need to consent for this AI ethics mechanism to happen? Is it accessible? What knowledge or resources are needed for this act of resistance? Is it, kind of knowledge and resources that exist among the group or people being harmed? Or is it knowledge or abilities that almost always exist within the benefiting group? So, again, if a method of addressing an AI harm requires expert knowledge of AI, there are probably going to be ties between those experts and like the companies benefiting from this AI harm, and that can complicate implementing this mitigation. Next, we looked at speed. How long does the active resistance take? Does it happen in time to stop the harm, or does it take much longer? And we argue that if it happens fast, if it's able to address the harm kind of as it's occurring, more people will use it. It'll be more helpful to people. And then finally, we looked at safety. What are the costs of this act of resistance? Is it, little or none, or are you potentially vulnerable to being targeted for resisting, or might resisting take away some things for you? So, yeah, thank you for listening to my talk. I'm happy to take questions. Yeah.
William, that was really good stuff. I'm going to give you a clap. Anyway, we've got a Q&A box. If people want to put a question in there, or you want to put your hand up, I can then open the mic to do it that way. And brilliant. I didn't even have to use one of my emergency questions. I saw a hand go straight up there. And it went down again though. Yeah, brilliant. Karina, I'm going to press allow to talk. So you'll have to press a button then, but if you can press that button, you should be able to speak.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, welcome.
Thank you so much for your talk. I have a question about preprints. Preprints have been
Hmm.
sort of normalized in the computer science research. And if you notice anything particularly on the take-up of preprints in your research and your analysis of these impacts. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Karina. William.
Yeah, I mean, Jack had that fascinating figure in his presentation, this like hockey stick of archived preprints. It is very, I think it really speaks to the value of speed in this area that, it's not enough to wait for a publishing cycle to share your work. You need to share it immediately. People are scooping each other, they're trying to go as fast as possible. And this value definitely manifests in many other ways. I think it manifests in not taking time to do rigorous evaluations or safety testing, not taking time to think about downstream consequences, this need for speed. Um, I think it also lets a lot of less well-reviewed work through and get communicated, certainly. Many conferences do have some sort of like ethics review process, but Archive does not. Archive is just kind of sharing your work a little bit. So I worry that it kind of spreads work that has not really been rigorously safety checked because of that. Um, but I don't know. There are interesting things going on in archive right now. There's also this whole world of people who are trying to like publish stuff to archive to build their resumes to get, jobs or PhD admissions or all this other stuff. Like there's an incredible amount of wealth in this area, and everybody um wants a piece of that. And that's understandable for a lot of people. So archive has also stopped accepting like survey papers and reviews, just because there's a lot of like scamming that goes on. Um, yeah, but I'd love to see more work studying like what goes on in archive, like what papers, especially papers that appear in archive but never get accepted elsewhere. Like, what is the deal with them? I'd be very curious.
Sounds like a research project, William. Josie Coburn, our colleague here at UCL, has a question. Josie, do you want to, if I press this, do you want to shout that out yourself?
Yes, sure. Yes.
Great.
So thank you for a really interesting talk. Great to hear about all your research. I'd just love to hear more about how you annotated the extremely large data set that you talked about in your paper on mapping the surveillance AI pipeline.
Thanks, Josie.
Yeah. No, it was definitely a challenge. We manually annotated, I think about 200 papers and 200 patents, just to see like what data were they using, kind of different things they discussed. We had this whole like spreadsheet of things we were annotating that I could share after this. And then from there, we went through to kind of identify keywords that we felt were highly indicative of certain categories we wanted broader information on. And then once we had these sets of keywords, we then ran a keyword search over the larger data set of, I think, 22,000 patents that directly cited CVPR papers. So that's the method we use. It's like it's definitely a pretty basic method. We did like a lot of validation to make sure that our keywords were actually returning what we wanted them to. But you could consider kind of more advanced NLP tools that might understand a bit more than just like a simple keyword and get you some better results.
Thanks, William. And a real simple follow-up. How long did that take you to do?
Yeah, this paper probably took us about, I don't know, 3 or 4 years. And like the last year and a half was just nature.
Yeah.
Nature is like a slog, but it definitely took us probably a year of just, looking at this data set, trying to figure out what we thought was interesting, what information we could extract from it, trying different annotation schemes, actually doing the annotation ourselves, doing a lot of double annotation to really like rigorously validate our results. It took us a while, and for most of it, we were having, you know, weekly meetings, and we would just like take a deep dive into like a sentence somebody saw that they thought was very telling, or you know, somebody thought that a category wasn't well defined, and then we do a deep dive into that. So yeah, we definitely took our time with annotation.
One of the things, I mean, there's a couple of things that jump out to me, and I'll just ask a quick question maybe. One is the manual work, the human work that isn't automated in this, and that's really impressive stuff. You just talked about that, but there's also an attention maybe that looking across your papers, I see a political attention around obfuscation. And one of the really notable things in the surveillance papers is that scientists don't often want to mention the thing, right? And the thing is being surveilled, or the thing is human bodies.
Mhm.
How do you get it? I mean, do you have a set of principles, a set of practices that that helps you pay attention to those kind of things?
Yeah, no, that was definitely one of the more interesting findings from our surveillance paper was this like obfuscation, and it wasn't in this presentation, but it is in this paper. We have like a figure showing kind of how some language use changes over time, and words that we might consider more directly indicative of surveillance. Some of them decrease in usage over time, and that might be related to a desire to obfuscate. We to deal with that, we really focused on the data being used in these patents. And we found that if we asked like what kinds of data are they handling, you know, is it data about bodies or body parts or faces? Or are there things that kind of help us cut through this just obfuscation and like the very like formal technical language in patents to understand, you know, exactly what is this being applied to. So we found that very helpful for this patent data set at least.
Oh, great. Any other questions, comments, thought? Jack, put your hand up if you want to go after Jack, and we'll get after you right after that. Jack.
Thanks, Kian. William, it's a follow-up on that question. So those of us that do quite a lot of work in the, you know, sort of science and responsibility type space would recognize the common response to your challenge about surveillance and computer vision research, right? Which is that, so I mean, it would be fascinating to get reflections from some researchers to these findings. One response that I think you're likely to find from researchers is, you know, even if they feel a bit queasy, or if this is a value that they think, you know, I'm not comfortable with this, they might justifiably say, well, we're not good at discussing those things, right? So they might turn it into an expertise issue and say, we, like a lot of researchers, are reductionist. We do the research that we can do. We aren't experts in the applications, say, of computer vision. And you know, we know from the history of science that there are also responses to that challenge. But I just wonder how you would, you know, having spent time with that data, whether you have some sympathy for that argument.
Yeah, I think unfortunately this kind of stuff, you know, understanding the societal impacts of your work is not often taught in schools. Maybe it's changing in some places. So I don't know. I guess I do have some sympathy if people just don't understand the impacts of their work, broader societal issues. I think like some sympathy. I don't know. I still think you can like read a newspaper. Well, it's hard to read a newspaper these days and not like get societal impacts of AI, and you'd have to be like a little incurious to not wonder about how your work is implicated in this. Um, but I think it's also very like interesting kind of challenge to us as people who work in AI ethics broadly of how do we take our knowledge and our expertise and how do we make it, you know, accessible to these people, but also like very visceral to them. Like how do we make our papers and our findings something that is really going to resonate with these people so that they do become curious in the societal impacts of their work, or they are, challenged by the societal impacts of the work and maybe change how they're approaching certain things. So I don't know, one like follow-up piece of work I want to do on the surveillance stuff is making like a Google Scholar, but for paper patent connections, and then letting people explore on their own, what patents are downstream of like my work or my advisor's work or my lab's work or my company's work. And am I okay with that? And I think this is both, making this paper more accessible to a wider audience, but also kind of using um maybe principles from pedagogy of like people like learning about themselves, people like generating knowledge on their own. If I just tell them, oh, your work is surveillance, that's one thing. But if I give them, a tool that appears very neutral and is just showing these connections that are objectively there, and then they kind of develop that conclusion on their own, that's going to be a much kind of stronger, more convincing thing to them. So I think that kind of work of, now that we're starting to generate this knowledge in very convincing ways, how do we go further and kind of make it something that has an impact on AI developers and researchers, on the public, on policymakers, something very, very convincing and urgent to them. I'm curious to see more work doing that.
Great. Other thoughts or comments from the audience? I'd love to tease out at least one more, to give William some value here. William, the last paper that you presented, and I mean this in the best way, it seemed like half a paper. It seemed like there was more to the story.
Yeah. Oh, Jack, seeing you cut off. Can you all hear him?
No, Kian, you've gone quiet. Try again. No. Having just made a comment about half a paper, you just did half a question. Maybe put it in the chat, Kian. We've
If I unmute here, is that going to work? Ian, do you want to start talking and see if everybody can hear you here?
Yeah, I mean, really, I guess it was a complimentary question, William. It seems like you're identifying opportunities for interventions, and I just wanted to give you an opportunity to say more about that. And particularly because if you go back to the framing and the rationale maybe for the meta science programming project that we've been funded to do, the opportunity there is using meta science, using the exhaust fumes of science, painting data, of bibliometrics, and to make pro-public interventions. It seems like you're doing something slightly more radical, slightly different, but I'd love your thoughts.
Yeah, so that paper, I was very interested in the concept of resistance and just what are things that people will do without organization, without a lot of like education or mobilization, but things they will do at scale to kind of reimpose their values or take back control over, in this case, technology and AI. And resistance has a very, very long history. There's a lot of stuff like, foot dragging, lying, thefts, skipping work, just all these different things that people will do when they are, kind of part of a power relationship that they don't like, to resist that power relationship. And I think there is already a lot of resistance to AI happening, everything from refusal to use an AI system that your workplace has bought, jailbreaking or messing with large language models in different ways, using a photo of somebody to fool a facial recognition system. These are all like examples of resistance. And resistance isn't necessarily for good purposes always. Sometimes it's for bad purposes, but it does have this property of people who are on kind of like the receiving end of a power relationship with technology and AI are taking some agency back. And I think that like that property overall is very interesting and probably a net good, because it resists concentration of power. So yeah, I mean, I do think that resistance is a way to kind of re-inject some public values into AI. I think it's already being done. There's some interesting research in this area around, anti-facial recognition systems like Fox and Loki, data poisoning like Nightshade, where people can use these very technical means to resist AI. But there's probably a lot of just resistance that people have come up with on their own that they're doing now that we don't really know about, and it'd be fascinating to see kind of more research into that and more understanding of like, is this kind of a pathway to giving the public control over AI if things like regulation fails, if AI developers, aren't nice to us, how can resistance play a role?
Thanks, William. Let me take over from Kian while he's having audio troubles. Just maybe in the last couple of minutes, William, there's so a couple more questions just pinged up into the Q&A. Both really interesting. The first one, just because we're short on time, I'll ask it myself. Do you think the harm done by AI can be seen as too diffuse and/or debatable as opposed to industries that had to change safety approaches based on concentrated high-profile disasters? And Amy says she works in the energy industry, big disasters, drilled into her over the years. Yes, indeed. Is AI behind the curve, or is there a bigger difference? And then we've also got a question from Dylan, another great question. Could efforts to decolonize AI risk replicating epistemic hierarchies if they rely on Western frameworks of transparency, privacy, fairness, etc., etc.? So don't feel like you have to dive deep on both of those, but both super interesting.
Yeah, no, thanks for the good questions. Amy, to your question, I think this is a very kind of salient and under discussed point currently in AI. A lot of the harms are very diffuse. Often it's like every artist now has 20 or 30% less income, or companies are hiring less, but it's not like there was an explosion or people died or something that really makes the news. It kind of feels like we're frogs in a pot of water that's slowly boiling. And I think this has stymied AI regulation to some extent. I'm sure like in the US, in many industries, and I'm sure in the UK as well, like a lot of regulations of industry are pretty directly connected to very bad disasters. Like that's what generates the pressure and the public outrage to have this, unfortunately. And I think that has changed a little bit in AI, because there have been some just extremely bad things happening. There's been kind of AI and mental health. There have been a lot of tragedies around that recently. And then AI and non-consensual intimate imagery and child sexual abuse material. Like there have been a lot of just very dire things around that recently. So I don't know. I think hopeful is the wrong word to use in this like context, but I do hope that these can lead to like broader regulations, than just like the immediate tragedies they present. Um, yeah, and I think it's worth thinking about like what policymakers, the public, the media latch on to, as we're trying to communicate other harms that AI is doing with them. Yeah, and then Timothy, to your question, absolutely. Definitely like, I don't know, if you had a Google or an OpenAI or a other big tech company that was, owned by people in a formerly colonized country, it probably wouldn't be much better. You can definitely still kind of replicate the concentration of power, the extractive nature, environmental harms, um, in a like less well specified decolonial theory, or maybe a more like surface level decolonial theory. I know Abeba has actually a great paper on this. You've probably seen it already, but kind of I think it is Power to the People. There might be another one, but she does look at a few efforts to kind of decolonize AI, and how, they can sometimes not live up to all the promises, when they just kind of replicate existing, Western AI structures elsewhere. Yeah, great question.
Thank you so much, William. That's been amazing. Thank you for presenting so much research. That's all of which will be useful to us. All of which is fascinating. Really, really interesting stuff. Thank you. Let's draw this to a close, almost on the hour. And thank you, Kian, for chairing. And I'm sorry that your virtual voice left you right at the right at the end. Thank you so much, William, for coming to take part in our webinar series, and hopefully we can find other ways to keep you involved in the work as we go forward. And the rest of you, thank you for coming. Please do spread the word. Come and join the next ones the next 2 weeks, same slot. It's been great to see you all. Bye bye.